In the silent depths of the Pacific, a U.S. submarine captain faced the unthinkable. His torpedoes refused to explode. Trapped beneath enemy waters, he turned disaster into brilliance, creating a deadly trap that changed the course of naval warfare forever. This is the true story the Navy tried to forget. The Pacific in 1942 was a dark, endless void. Beneath its surface, America's fight for survival depended not on the roar of engines or the thunder of artillery, but on the quiet heartbeat of steel submarines slipping through the deep. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy was forced to rethink everything it knew about war at sea. Battleships had been shattered, aircraft carriers were scarce, and Japan's empire stretched across half the ocean. What America had left were submarines, sleek, hungry predators built for stealth and endurance. But hidden within their steel hulls was a secret flaw that almost doomed the men who sailed them. The story begins aboard the USS Tenosa, a Gato-class submarine prowling the mid-Pacific under the command of Lieutenant Commander Dan Daspit. Daspit wasn't a man who scared easily. He had a pilot's precision, a sailor's patience, and the cold discipline that only submarine service could teach. Every dive meant sealing yourself in a pressure hull where sunlight vanished and the ocean pressed down like a mountain. Inside, men worked in the dim red glow of control panels, listening to the hum of machinery and the ping of the sonar, their only link to the world above. Daspit's mission was simple on paper: cut off Japanese supply lines. In practice, it was suicide. The Imperial Navy ruled the surface. Convoys were heavily armed, guarded by destroyers trained in anti-submarine warfare. The Americans had one advantage: the element of surprise. But even that depended on a weapon that, in 1942, couldn't be trusted to do its job: the Mark 14 torpedo. On the surface, it was a masterpiece of engineering, a weapon designed for precision. It could travel more than 4,000 yards, strike beneath a ship's keel, and explode with enough force to snap a destroyer in half. Yet for reasons no one fully understood, the Mark 14s kept failing. They ran too deep, missed their targets, or worse, hit and didn't detonate. Captains filed report after report, but the Navy Bureau of Ordnance dismissed the complaints. Crew error, they said. Poor maintenance. Faulty firing solutions. To the men in the submarines, those words stung. They were risking everything, only to watch their perfect weapon spit, cough, and die. By July 1943, the Tenosa was hunting near the Truk Lagoon, one of Japan's most vital supply arteries. It was there that Daspit's moment of genius, born from failure, would rewrite the book on submarine warfare. That morning, sonar picked up a slow-moving target, a Japanese tanker named Tonin Maru No. 3. She was massive, over 19,000 tons, carrying vital fuel for the Japanese fleet. To sink her would cripple the enemy's logistics. Daspit moved carefully, setting up his attack from periscope depth. The crew went silent. The only sound was the whisper of compressed air as the first torpedo slid into the tube. Fire 1. A trail of bubbles rose through the dark water. Seconds passed. The men waited for the boom. Nothing. Fire 2. Again, the same silence. The torpedoes struck the tanker's hull and simply failed to explode. Daspit clenched his fists but didn't speak. This wasn't panic. It was calculation. He circled the target and attacked again. 6 torpedoes. 6 failures. By now, any ordinary commander would have broken off, written it off as bad luck, and returned home. But Daspit refused to let it end there. The Tonin Maru was dead in the water, unable to move. Her escorts were searching wildly, convinced the American sub was out of range. What they didn't know was that Daspit was setting a trap, the kind no manual had ever written. He ordered the crew to reload the tubes manually, a brutal task that took hours in the cramped torpedo room. Sweat poured from the men's faces as they wrestled 3,000-pound weapons into position. Above them, the Japanese ship drifted helplessly, unaware that the Tenosa was still lurking below. Daspit studied his firing data again. Everything was correct: the depth, the range, the gyro angle. It wasn't the crew. It wasn't the aim. Something was wrong with the weapon itself, and now he intended to prove it. He maneuvered the submarine into position, steadying it for one last shot. "Fire 10, he said quietly. The torpedo left the tube, tracked straight, hit the tanker midships, and failed again. This time, Daspit exploded in anger, not at his men, but at the weapon that betrayed them. He surfaced, closing the distance until the tanker loomed above the waves. The Japanese crew, confused and terrified, couldn't believe what they were seeing. A U.S. submarine brazenly floating in plain sight. Daspit ordered one final shot, aimed from point-blank range. The torpedo struck dead center. No explosion. Daspit had his proof. He gathered the data, every firing angle, every failure, and when the Tenosa returned to Pearl Harbor, he personally reported the findings to Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Fleet. Lockwood was furious, not at Daspit, but at the Navy's bureaucracy that had ignored the warnings. Daspit's evidence triggered one of the most urgent technical investigations of the war. It turned out the Mark 14's magnetic exploders were overly sensitive and miscalibrated. They detonated prematurely or not at all, depending on the Earth's magnetic field. Worse, the contact detonators crushed on impact at 90 degrees, the exact angle of a perfect shot. In short, the torpedo worked only when it missed correctly. For Daspit and his crew, that discovery came too late to help them at Truk, but their ordeal forced the Navy to act. Lockwood ordered the magnetic exploders disabled across the fleet. He told his captains to conduct live-fire tests against captured Japanese ships. What they found changed everything. By late 1943, American submarines were armed with fully reliable torpedoes for the first time. Their kill rates skyrocketed. Japan's merchant fleet began to vanish, strangled by a silent blockade. And it all began because one captain refused to surrender to failure. The transformation wasn't just technical, it was psychological. The Navy had learned that innovation didn't come from bureaucracy. It came from the men in the field who faced the consequences. Daspit's defiance embodied the American spirit of adaptation under fire. But beneath the triumph lay something deeper. The war beneath the waves was brutal. A single mistake meant death. Every dive was a gamble, every surfacing a breath of borrowed time. The Tenosa's story captured the essence of submarine warfare. Not the glory of explosions, but the patience, fear, and intellect that defined victory in the deep. As word of Daspit's stand spread through the fleet, younger captains took note. They began to experiment, to question, to refine. The Navy's doctrine evolved from rigid procedures to tactical creativity. Submarine warfare became a contest of brains as much as machinery. And while the Germans boasted of their U-boats prowling the Atlantic, it was the American captains in the Pacific who turned technology and intelligence into an art form. The U.S. Navy's undersea campaign would go on to sink over half of Japan's merchant tonnage, cutting off its empire from within. It started with one broken torpedo, one frustrated commander, and one decision that redefined how wars are fought beneath the sea. When the USS Tenosa limped back to Pearl Harbor in the summer of 1943, its crew expected little more than another debriefing, another round of blame, another note buried in Navy paperwork. Instead, Lieutenant Commander Dan Daspit's report ignited something far bigger, a reckoning. His data, precise and undeniable, forced the Navy to face an uncomfortable truth. America's most advanced torpedo was a failure built on arrogance. For years, the Bureau of Ordnance had refused to listen. Its engineers had designed the Mark 14 torpedo and its magnetic exploder, the Mark 6, with faith bordering on hubris. They believed their design was flawless, tested under ideal peacetime conditions. But those tests had been done in calm bays, not the open ocean. The torpedoes had never been fired at real ships, never tested at war depths, never exposed to pressure, current, or the unpredictable magnetism of the Earth itself. Daspit's mission changed all that. When Admiral Charles Lockwood read the report, he didn't see failure. He saw opportunity. Lockwood, a submariner himself, understood the human cost of faulty weapons. Too many captains had been told they were missing when they weren't. Too many crews had risked everything only to watch their torpedoes bounce off enemy hulls like toy darts. Lockwood was determined to end it. He ordered a series of live-fire tests off Hawaii using captured Japanese ships as targets. These tests would either vindicate or expose the Bureau's design. Engineers and sailors gathered on the beach as the first torpedo streaked through the water and struck the target ship squarely. The hit was perfect, and yet there was no explosion. The weapon simply thudded and sank. The truth was undeniable. Lockwood sent an urgent message to Washington. If the Bureau of Ordnance can't provide us with reliable torpedoes, then for God's sake, get out of the way and let us fix them ourselves. That defiance marked a turning point in U.S. naval engineering. For the first time, frontline officers were authorized to run their own experiments, to tinker, to adapt. The Mark VI magnetic exploder was disabled across the fleet. Instead of relying on magnetic detonation beneath the keel, captains were told to use contact fuses and aim for the sides of ships. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. But this change wasn't just mechanical, it was cultural. The Navy had long been driven by rigid hierarchy, where orders flowed downward and innovation was strangled by procedure. Daspit's stand shattered that. Commanders now trusted the instincts of the men who lived and fought inside those submarines. The war beneath the sea began to shift from engineering arrogance to field-driven ingenuity. In submarine bases from Fremantle to Midway, mechanics and engineers became inventors. They modified firing pins, redesigned depth control valves, even altered the guidance gyros with makeshift tools and sheer determination. Each boat carried its own secrets, tricks of calibration, personal techniques for accuracy. The submarine force became an incubator of constant, quiet innovation. While German engineers in the Atlantic clung to doctrine, obsessed with new superweapons like the Type XXI U-boat, American crews focused on refining what they had. Their strength came from adaptability. By late 1943, the results were clear. Submarine tonnage sunk, rose dramatically. In the first months of the war, U.S. boats had struggled to sink even a handful of Japanese ships each month. Now they were sinking convoys. The once untouchable Japanese supply network began to collapse, strangled by invisible hunters. The Japanese Navy never fully understood what had changed. To them, the American submarines seemed suddenly omniscient. Their attacks precise, relentless, coordinated. But behind that transformation wasn't new hardware. It was the power of human observation, field learning, and the refusal to accept mediocrity. And in the quiet halls of Pearl Harbor's submarine force headquarters, a new kind of warfare was being born, data-driven command. Lockwood established a system that gathered after-action reports from every submarine patrol. Captains were encouraged to share not just results, but methods, firing angles, ocean conditions, weapon behavior, enemy response. This information was compiled, analyzed, and distributed to the fleet. It became an evolving manual written by those who fought the war daily. Every successful strike, every failed torpedo, every destroyed convoy added to a growing pool of collective intelligence. The submarine fleet became a living organism, learning and improving with each mission. The Germans had long prided themselves on their technical brilliance. Their torpedoes, powered by hydrogen peroxide and guided by acoustic seekers, were more advanced on paper. But the Kriegsmarine suffered from one fatal flaw. They couldn't adapt quickly. Bureaucracy stifled feedback. Commanders who questioned design orders were replaced. In contrast, the Americans learned to embrace failure as information. When a torpedo malfunctioned, it wasn't an embarrassment. It was an opportunity to refine the next shot. This mindset shift echoed across the Pacific. By 1944, the U.S. submarine fleet was no longer a struggling branch of the Navy. It was a precision strike force. Each captain had learned the art of patience, stealth, and timing. They no longer fired salvos blindly. Instead, they stalked convoys for hours, waiting for perfect alignment, ensuring every shot counted. And beneath that precision was a new weapon, the Mark 18 torpedo. Developed in secret during the height of the torpedo crisis, the Mark 18 was America's first electric torpedo, silent, wakeless, and deadly. Unlike the compressed air Mark 14, it left no bubble trail. The idea had been inspired by captured German designs, but the U.S. Navy didn't just copy it, they improved it. Engineers at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport streamlined the propulsion, replaced volatile chemicals with safe battery systems, and increased reliability under high pressure. By the time it entered combat in mid-1944, the Mark 18 gave American submarines an unprecedented advantage. Japanese escorts could no longer trace torpedo trails to launch counterattacks. Entire convoys vanished without warning. The transformation was complete. Yet behind every technical breakthrough lay a human cost. The ocean was still merciless. Submarine duty remained one of the most dangerous assignments in the Navy. Depth charge attacks could crush a boat in seconds. Air inside the hull grew heavy with diesel fumes and fear. Crews went weeks without sunlight. Many never came back. But those who did return knew they were part of something larger, a silent war that was turning the tide. In Washington, Navy leaders finally acknowledged the scale of what had happened. The torpedo scandal, as some called it, had revealed the dangers of blind confidence. It became a lesson in humility that shaped post-war military research for decades. Testing became rigorous. Field data was prioritized over laboratory theory, and the men of the submarine force, once dismissed as outliers, were now recognized as pioneers. For Admiral Lockwood, the victory was personal. He had believed in his captains when the system didn't. He had championed experimentation in a service that prized tradition. And for Dan Daspit, whose frustration in 1943 had sparked it all, vindication came quietly. He never sought fame. To him, the true reward was knowing that future submariners would never have to fight with broken weapons again. The Tenosa's failed torpedoes had exposed the Navy's greatest weakness, and in doing so, revealed its greatest strength, the ability to learn. By the end of 1944, the United States had transformed its undersea fleet into a weapon of precision, guided not by theory, but by experience. Japan's war machine, once fed by endless shipping lines, now starved in silence. And beneath the waves, a new kind of American warfare had emerged, one where intelligence, adaptability, and courage were more powerful than any single invention. The Pacific had taught the Navy a hard truth. Machines don't win wars. People do. By 1944, the tide of the Pacific War was shifting, not just on maps, but deep beneath the waves. American submarines, once crippled by faulty weapons and rigid doctrine, had evolved into precision instruments of strategy. The lessons born from Dan Daspit's failed torpedoes aboard the Tenosa now rippled across the fleet. What began as a single captain's defiance had become a revolution in silent warfare, one that would choke Japan's empire from within. The transformation started with intelligence. Admiral Charles Lockwood's new system of data sharing had changed everything. Every patrol brought back not just stories of combat, but logs filled with speed calculations, depth settings, weather readings, and sonar data. Crews compared notes, analyzing enemy convoy routes and evasive maneuvers. Submarine warfare had turned into a science, one built from the observations of men living on the edge of survival. In the early years of the war, submarine tactics were cautious and rigid. Captains were taught to strike from distance, fire a spread, then dive deep and run silent. But with better weapons and sharper information, the new generation of commanders adopted a bolder, almost predatory approach. They began attacking from within the screen of escort destroyers, exploiting blind zones, and timing shots to perfection. One of those captains was Commander Dudley Mush Morton of the USS WWII. His tactics mirrored the new philosophy that men like Daspit and Lockwood had made possible. Morton didn't just hunt ships, he hunted patterns. He studied how Japanese captains zigzagged, how escorts reacted, and where convoys clustered. The Wahoo would surface at night, engines roaring, and fire torpedoes from point-blank range before slipping into the dark. Morton's daring methods showed what American submarines could achieve when freed from outdated restrictions. By the summer of 1944, Japan's merchant fleet was in crisis. Tankers, freighters, troop transports, all were easy prey. The Pacific had turned into a graveyard of steel. Entire convoys vanished overnight, sunk by unseen hands. American submarines were no longer just hunters, they were stranglers. Every ship that went down meant fewer supplies for the front, fewer planes in the air, fewer bullets in the jungle. Japan's war machine was starving. This wasn't luck. It was method. The same disciplined precision that Daspit displayed on the Tenosa had become standard. Every torpedo fired was measured, analyzed, and logged. When the Mark 18 electric torpedo entered full service, it amplified that precision. Without the telltale bubble trails of older models, Japanese escorts lost their ability to retaliate effectively. In the chaos of convoy defense, even the best-trained destroyer captains could only guess where the attack had come from. Japanese overconfidence played into American hands. Early in the war, Tokyo had assumed the United States would never master submarine warfare. Their surface fleet was built for decisive battles, not for fighting ghosts. They had underestimated how fast American ingenuity could adapt. While Japanese engineers focused on grand designs, massive battleships like the Yamato, new torpedoes with range but little precision, the U.S. Navy refined reliability, coordination, and stealth. Technology wasn't the only advantage. The human factor mattered most. Submarine crews were volunteers, men who had chosen a life of confinement and risk. They were some of the most technically skilled sailors in the Navy, trained to maintain engines, navigate by instinct, and repair machinery blindfolded. In combat, their trust in one another was absolute. When a torpedo left the tube, every man aboard felt the same pulse of fear and hope. They had learned the hard way that success didn't depend on luck, it depended on preparation. Each mission was a journey into isolation. The boats slipped silently out of Pearl Harbor or Fremantle, their hulls stocked with torpedoes and rationed food. They might not surface for weeks. In those endless patrols, the sea became both enemy and ally. Crews slept beside engines, their dreams haunted by the echo of sonar pings and the metallic ring of depth charges. When attacks came, they felt the violence of the ocean itself. Explosions that shook the hull, bolts that screamed under pressure, gauges that trembled between survival and oblivion. And yet, they returned. They always returned with data, with experience, with knowledge that improved the next patrol. The war beneath the sea became a chain of learning that no enemy could see or stop. As 1944 drew on, the U.S. submarine fleet began targeting not just supply ships, but the very arteries of Japan's empire. Oil from Borneo, iron from China, food from Indochina. The impact was devastating. By the end of the year, Japan had lost over half its merchant fleet. Entire islands in its empire went dark. Factories shut down. Aircraft production stalled. The Japanese Navy's fuel reserves dwindled so low that many ships never left harbor again. At the same time, U.S. submarines played a crucial role in a larger Allied strategy. Their intelligence reports shaped carrier strikes and amphibious operations. Before the Battle of the Philippine Sea, submarines like the Kavala and Albacore delivered fatal blows that crippled Japanese carrier strength. When the Taiho, Japan's newest carrier, went down from a single torpedo hit, it proved that the undersea war had become the equal of any fleet action. Behind every victory was the unseen influence of Daspit's stand. His insistence on truth over bureaucracy had forced the Navy to build weapons that actually worked and to trust the instincts of its sailors. That change in mindset extended beyond torpedoes. Radar, sonar, and cryptography all benefited from the same open feedback culture. Field data flowed freely between ships, bases, and labs. America's technological edge grew sharper with every mission. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's leadership refused to believe that submarines alone could be causing such devastation. Reports of convoys disappearing without survivors were dismissed as exaggerations. Japanese captains begged for improved sonar, more escort ships, new tactics, but the industrial system was already collapsing. The arrogance that once fueled Japan's expansion now blinded it to reality. Meanwhile, American submarines were perfecting a brutal rhythm: track, strike, vanish. They used wolfpack tactics, small groups of boats coordinating attacks across vast distances. A Japanese convoy might see one periscope, only to be struck from a different direction moments later. These coordinated strikes paralyzed the enemy's ability to defend or retreat. The Pacific had become a chessboard of moving shadows, and the Americans were always one move ahead. By early 1945, submarine warfare had evolved into something far beyond its 1942 beginnings. The fleet had not just improved, it had become a symbol of American resilience and intelligence. In 3 years, it had transformed from a broken, doubted force into the spearhead of victory at sea, and all traced back to one defining moment, when a frustrated captain refused to accept failure as fate. Dan Daspit's persistence on that July day in 1943 had done more than fix a weapon. It had exposed the Navy's greatest strength, the courage to confront its own mistakes. The Japanese Navy, once proud and confident, now drifted in silence. Their great ships had no fuel, their convoys no escorts, their empire no lifeline. Beneath the waves, American submariners continued their deadly craft, unseen but unstoppable, guided by lessons learned in the hardest way possible. The ocean that had once concealed defeat now carried the echo of quiet triumph. The sound of engines rising from the deep, carrying the men who had turned failure into one of the greatest strategic victories in history. By 1945, the Pacific Ocean had become the silent witness to the end of an empire. The once invincible Imperial Japanese Navy was reduced to rusting hulks in shallow harbors, its fuel reserves nearly gone, its ships idle and helpless. What no grand fleet engagement could accomplish, American submarines had achieved through persistence, intelligence, and innovation. The transformation that began with Dan Daspit's broken torpedoes aboard the USS Tenosa had reached its final act, a quiet, relentless victory that redefined sea warfare forever. The war's final year was a study in contrast. Above the surface, battles raged across islands and skies: Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the firebombing of Tokyo. The world watched the spectacle of destruction. But beneath the waves, a different war unfolded. It was unseen, uncelebrated, but decisive. Submarine captains hunted without rest, not for glory, but to complete the blockade that would suffocate Japan's war machine once and for all. By early spring, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war strength. From more than 6 million tons of shipping, less than 1 million remained afloat. The U.S. submarines, representing barely 2% of the Navy's manpower, had sunk over half of Japan's total tonnage. No other arm of the American military inflicted such proportionate damage for its size. It was warfare perfected through intellect rather than sheer numbers, the culmination of lessons learned from hardship, error, and adaptation. Each patrol carried the weight of that history. Captains like Gene Fluckey of the USS Barb embodied the new spirit of submarine warfare: creative, fearless, and pragmatic. Fluckey didn't just rely on standard tactics. He experimented constantly. He used radar to coordinate night surface attacks, fired torpedoes in patterns never taught in manuals, and even turned his submarine into a demolition platform, launching commandos onto Japanese shores to sabotage trains. This kind of improvisation had become the Navy's greatest weapon. The Japanese, once so confident in their naval supremacy, could only react. Their supply convoys dwindled, their destroyers were too few to protect what remained, and their new anti-submarine aircraft lacked fuel to fly. The Empire's islands began to starve. Civilians rationed rice. Factories slowed. Even the warships that survived the bombings were reduced to floating prisons. Every gallon of oil sunk by American submarines was a blow to Japan's ability to fight another day. But the cost for the men who made it happen was steep. Submarine warfare never became easy. For every victory report, there were names struck from the rolls, boats that vanished without trace. The ocean swallowed them whole, leaving only silence. Out of 288 American submarines deployed during the war, 52 were lost with all hands. The men who served beneath the sea carried that knowledge every time they dived. They fought with the understanding that one mechanical failure, one unlucky ping from an enemy sonar, could end everything. Yet they went back, again and again, because they believed their fight mattered. By the time the atomic bombs fell, the submariners had already completed their mission. Japan's industrial heart had been throttled long before Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The collapse of its economy and military logistics had begun months earlier beneath the waves. When Emperor Hirohito announced surrender in August 1945, many in the submarine fleet listened from their cramped compartments, far from home, engines humming quietly as they absorbed the words that ended years of danger and sacrifice. For them, victory was not a cheer, it was a long, exhaled silence. In the aftermath, the Navy began to take stock. What had started as a campaign of desperation had become a triumph of adaptation. The torpedo scandal, once a shameful secret, was now a vital lesson in humility. Engineers and officers realized that innovation could not survive without honesty from the field. The Bureau of Ordnance, once untouchable, was restructured. Testing procedures were rewritten. New weapons would never again be approved without combat-realistic trials. Dan Daspit's fight against bureaucratic blindness had become doctrine. His meticulous records, once dismissed as complaints, were studied by post-war strategists. They saw in his frustration a blueprint for progress, the idea that the front line was the real laboratory of war. That philosophy carried into the Cold War. The lessons of the Tenosa and Admiral Lockwood's submarine fleet guided the creation of the next generation of undersea warfare. When nuclear submarines like the USS Nautilus emerged a decade later, they were built not only on technological innovation, but also on the culture of questioning and experimentation that Daspit's generation had forged. The principles of redundancy, feedback, and field-driven design became embedded in American military research. Engineers learned that a weapon's success depended not on what it promised in theory, but on how it performed in the hands of those who risked their lives using it. Beyond the technical evolution, there was something deeper, a moral understanding of resilience. The men of the submarine service had shown that courage wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet and methodical, the kind that worked through frustration instead of fear. They fought not in the open, but in steel coffins under crushing pressure, where seconds could mean life or death. Their calm, their precision, and their refusal to give up when everything failed defined a different kind of heroism. For the American public, submarine warfare remained largely invisible. The headlines went to the great battles and the bombings. But among those who knew, the submariners were legends. After the war, Admiral Lockwood described them simply. They went down to the sea in machines, and they came back with victory in their hands. It was no exaggeration. The undersea campaign had shortened the war by months, perhaps years. It had starved Japan into submission, saving countless Allied lives that might have been lost in an invasion. And behind it all stood a single moment of defiance, one captain refusing to accept the unacceptable. Dan Daspit never claimed to be a hero. When asked years later about the Tenosa's failed torpedoes, he spoke plainly. "We did our job. We found what was wrong. Someone had to." His calm words hid the weight of what he had done, exposing flaws that the Navy had been too proud to admit, and setting in motion a transformation that would reshape warfare. The Pacific War ended with the roar of bombs and the silence of surrender. But its most enduring revolution happened underwater. It was a story of human minds pushing against the limits of machines, of leadership that listened, of faith in problem-solving over perfection. The submarine force had become a living example of how America fought, not with certainty, but with determination, creativity, and an unshakable belief that failure was only the beginning of understanding. When the submarines of the Pacific Fleet finally returned home, they sailed into Pearl Harbor under quiet skies. Their decks were lined with men who had spent years in darkness. They were thinner, older, changed. Some carried souvenirs from sunken ships. Others carried memories they would never speak aloud. But they all carried the same legacy, proof that persistence and intellect could overcome even the ocean's cold indifference. As their boats glided past the wrecks, still visible in the harbor from the attack that started it all, they knew how far they'd come. America had entered the war uncertain and wounded. It ended it as a nation that had learned to fight with both heart and reason. And beneath the surface of that victory was the hum of a submarine, the echo of a torpedo that once refused to explode, and the man who turned that failure into a weapon of truth. The ocean kept its secrets, but history did not. The story of the Tenosa, of Daspit, and of the men who followed him remains one of the quiet triumphs of World War II. Proof that even in the darkest depths, when everything fails, the human mind can find a way to win.